are not aware of what they are doing. They are not aware of anything, you know. And they have no idea what is science. The rules of science is to question everything. And when we question something, oh, they say you are make a conspiracy against the state. And true, it's a conspiracy against the state because this is religion, and this is the only source of the state to have its power demonstrated, right? So this is very interesting how far this is going. When do they stand up? Or we can change it, transform it before a catastrophe into the good. That's why we are sitting here.
Sometimes looking at things from a new perspective is so easy and fluid and expansive. And sometimes it's a lot of hard work.
It was founded the year of the last London Olympics in 1948. And we're going to see a very special example.
Veuillez accueillir Mike Oldfield, accompagné du personnel du National Health Service et de nos invités d'honneur, des patients et le personnel du Great Ormond Street Hospital.
Please welcome Mike Oldfield and the staff of the United Kingdom National Health Service, and our very special guest this evening, patients and staff of Great Ormond Street Hospital.
Well, certainly, as I was saying, a very special hospital looking after children. To see some of the great villains of British literature for children.
We are back at the Martin Luther King Jr. Hospital. So a few hours later, we were here at 11 this morning, and just to show you that there is still absolutely no patients, like zero. There's like not even like anyone, no staffs. Remember, this was the hospital where New York Times and Newsweek reported that it's a hospital overflowing with patients in the lobby, in the gift shop. Excuse me? Okay, well, I'm having a conversation, so, but appreciate it. Thank you. The frontline workers, you know, the heroes. The gift shop is off premises for the public. You cannot go there, but it's completely empty. All right. I was by there. I was hoping that I would be able to get in and report it for you. They obviously don't allow anyone to go in there, and it's completely empty. You know, what is very interesting is the people actually working there, like getting up in the morning and being part of the show. Like, how do they feel?
Very interesting for me personally to recognize that this is spiritual warfare and really sorcery. The power of words as spells, as literal spells that are cast, you know, and neurolinguistic programming and other areas of psychology have explored, you know, how powerful a three-word phrase could be: safer at home, right? That when we are marinating in these iterated phrases and we hear them and see them and read them, that they subliminally impact us in the same way that a spell cast would, really, where we are not conscious of our experience of manipulation.
In this current state that we're in, there is a great effort to provoke a fear response in the population. And that in and of itself is going to create ill health. And when you get into other realms of physics, we can even explain at great length how that will create very exact changes in our biology and even become a self-fulfilling prophecy that will create the very symptoms that are then blamed on a microbe that's so-called going through the population.
Thoughts create things, good and bad. Our thoughts are very powerful.
We have so much trauma installed within us, potentially accidental or inherited intergenerationally from previous generations who, for example, experienced the horrors of war. So when we have that installed in us, we haven't resolved our own traumas, it is so easy to trigger the fear response, under the auspices of trying to save us from deadly particles. And so I think ultimately when we can attain healing and sovereignty within our own self, we become less susceptible to what is fundamentally irrational fear.
This most inhumane behavior and treatment of obstructing the two airways, the nose and the mouth, that we need in order to breathe and to take in oxygen. And to then be told that somehow this is virtuous, is evil at its best, or do I say worst?
We're under a spell. The spell is materialism. That's the science that we're told is real.
When we're so fixated on the germ theory, we stop looking at other causes and we never really find a solution.
I think we should try to see the reality for what it is and then act with courage and intelligence.
I'm not let down by the politicians, the big corporations. I didn't trust them to begin with. What I am disappointed by are the Americans who are giving in to this Faustian bargain without putting up a fight, without standing up, without pushing back against the lies. That actually surprises me. I did not expect so many Americans to be so compliant with the bargain.
With children, it's just absolutely criminal what we're doing to them, because they, more than anybody, are in a very formative stage where they need that face-to-face contact. They need to be able to read the expressions on our face and not feel that there is something wrong with them, flawed in their biology. This is all about fear. And if people were not afraid, you would see this disappear literally overnight.
There is no existence of a virus, and unfortunately you need a child to be able to point to the emperor and say he's got no clothes on.
Once we can understand that it's a model that is bankrupt, that's built on fraud and misinterpretation, then we can liberate ourselves from it and move towards something much more truthful.
Hey, Jason. I could really use your help with a little narration and discussion along this journey.
My pleasure. I'm sure we won't find all of the answers, but as we explore, hopefully we'll be able to identify that which isn't.
Which opens up the door to discovering that which is.
If you're serious about trying to get to the truth, you have to always keep digging down to the next layer, and eventually you're going to get to that model itself.
The interesting thing about the germ theory, it was formulated in the 1800s. The two main proponents were Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. Basically, they said there's one germ for every disease, one microorganism for every disease. And if they couldn't find the microorganism, they said, well, it's too small to see in our microscopes. We'll just call it a virus, which means poison.
If most illnesses really are due to poison, and virus actually means poison, then it's a truthful word. However, that's not how it's described by any medical or scientific textbook.
It's a problematic word.
It's been completely changed in the modern era to refer to some sort of particle containing genetic material that causes illness and is contagious. This simply has never been proven to be the case.
They could never prove that plain old bacteria could make a person sick. They could find the bacteria in sick people, but they couldn't make well people sick by exposing them to this bacteria. The Public Health Service did a big study to try to prove that the Spanish flu was contagious, and they completely failed. They could not make well people sick by exposing them to sick people. They took blood from sick people and put it in well people. They had sick people spit on well people. They had mucus from sick people and squirted it into the well people. And then not one case could they make a healthy person sick by exposure to a sick person.
Jason, let's take a look at this paper and see for ourselves. Okay, so we've got Boston Harbor volunteers from the Navy.
Okay, volunteers, around 30 years old, all were in good physical condition.
Right, 100 of them. Okay, so they administered Pfeiffer's bacillus in a moderate amount into the nostrils of a few of the volunteers. Let's see, this particular 1 cc sprayed into each nostril and into the throat while inspiring and on the eye. None of these took sick. Good Lord.
Nostril is blown vigorously into the tray. This is then repeated with the other nostril. The patient then gargles with the solution.
Next was injections of blood. 10 cc's of whole blood were injected into each of the 10 volunteers. None of them took sick in any way.
The volunteer was led up to the patient's bed, shook hands, got as close as possible. Then the patient breathed out as hard as he could while the volunteer was muzzle to muzzle with him. Received the expired breath and at the same time was breathing in as the patient was breathing out. After they'd done this 5 times, the patient coughed directly into the face of the volunteer, face to face, 5 different times.
None of them took sick in any way. Well, it certainly wasn't from lack of trying.
We can say categorically that the Spanish flu was not contagious.
Filtered secretions. 36 hours, a young man's temperature rose and remained above normal for a week. Tested positive for strep throat.
Germ theory is the theory that states that there is a germ, which is some kind of microscopic organism that comes from the outside, invades our bodies, and causes disease. Viruses are one alleged type of germ. It can't reproduce, it can't move on its own, it cannot take things in that it eats and has metabolism or respiration. Bacteria can do all those things.
We usually find them in association with disease.
Find bacteria?
Find bacteria, and that's because one of the many roles of bacteria is to clean up dead tissue. And when you have dead or inflamed, dying tissue, the bacteria appear. That is one of their important roles in life. But to blame the disease on the bacteria is like blaming maggots for killing the dog, because you always find maggots on the dead dog. Maggots only eat dead tissue. They will not eat live tissue. We know this from maggot therapy, where they put maggots on wounds that won't heal. Blaming the disease on the bacteria is like telling people that the dog died because it was attacked by maggots, you know.
Many times when the narrative is not truthful about something, there's something particular about the words and language. And what I mean specifically is that meanings are inverted. And whenever I see inversions of meanings it causes suspicion, and almost always there's something there. Germ means a new budding or new growth or new life. And that's why we germinate seeds to grow it every season anew. And that's why the germ cells of our body are the egg and the sperm cells that bring on our next generation. Changing the meaning to an invasive, microscopic organism that will make you sick and even kill you. It's the opposite meaning.
Many times we're actually asked to prove that the virus doesn't exist. But in actuality, it's the other way around, okay? Because we didn't make a claim that a virus exists or make any other claims really. But there has been a claim made, and in fact, it's changing the entire world. So it's a very, very serious claim, and it needs to be backed up by very serious and convincing evidence.
Just to put this in perspective, whenever I'm in the audience and somebody asks me to raise my hand, I never raise my hand. No matter whether I agree or not, I just, on principle, don't. But don't, please, don't do that. How many of you in this room think that the 9/11 story that we've been told is the whole truth and nothing but the truth? Please raise your hand if you think that. Right, nobody thinks that.
I believe in science.
Okay. That's sort of what I thought. But nobody looks into it. There is no investigation. There is no forensic. You could say, well, I don't necessarily know, although I'm sure a lot of you have ideas, what happened. But it can't possibly be that. We can't find the virus. We already know that. And then it supposedly attaches to the receptor in a cell membrane. There's now currently 17 different theories as to what a cell membrane is made of. So some people say it's a lipid bilayer, some people say it's a fluid mosaic model, and there's 15 other theories. And as I've said over and over, the reason there's 17 models of a cell membrane and only one model of a schnauzer, as a dog, is because everybody knows what a schnauzer is, you can see it, and nobody has ever seen a living cell membrane. Nobody. This is important because something like 50 to 80% of our current pharmaceuticals are meant to work on interaction with receptors in the cell membrane, like opiate receptors and serotonin receptors for all the antidepressants and all the other ones. So it would be nice to confirm that actually these receptors in fact exist.
You use the fake virus to create a fake test. You use it to restrict freedoms such as business closures, lockdowns, and quarantine. You restrict travel, the mass ritual, and of course the vaccine, which some feel is the one of the penultimate goals. So if you can demonstrate that there isn't a virus causing a disease, then you immediately know all of these things are unnecessary and inappropriate. You don't have to evaluate them any further.
Virus model, everybody knows it is design, right? Being taught or being generated in the computer does not matter. But and now it becomes really interesting. If you go into every single paper on SARS-CoV-2, any other virus which is shown in the electron microscope, you'll find in the description that this particle photographed never ever has been used to be biochemically characterized.
There's no known genetic sequence. Of course, how could you know the genetic sequence of something you haven't shown to exist? There are no mutations or genetic variants, of course, because there's no original. There's no way to develop a test. What would you base the test on? And there's no way to demonstrate that this imaginary particle causes a disease because it hasn't been shown to actually exist.
The word isolation says clearly you isolated something out of its environment, out of other matter. So like when a child is going to the bank, with his pig where the money is all in, and then it's opened, and then you separate the coins from chewing gums or other things, and then you check, there are really coins, So you have isolated a dollar or a euro, right? And here we go.
The technique of isolating a virus from a fluid has been around for 70 years. And then showing with pictures and electron microscope that that's all I have. Even though electron microscopes create artifacts and maybe that's not what it actually looks like, at least we know this is isolated, purified virus. Then you could study it, characterize it, see what it's made of, expose an animal to it, and document that the animal gets sick in the same way, not by injecting it into its eyeball as they did with TB, not by injecting it into their abdomen, which is not how diseases get transmitted in normal life, but by exposing people in the way that you think the disease is transmitted. And the fact of the matter is that was never done with HIV and AIDS. In fact, there's been awards for $100,000 for anybody to show isolated HIV particles from somebody with AIDS. They can't do it. It's simply not there. It hasn't been done for measles. It hasn't been done for Ebola, Zika. It hasn't been done for SARS-CoV-2.
In the following 6 published papers, Andy examines their body of work and finds that their conclusions contradict the claims made in the titles and/or the introductions.
The Kim paper has something really problematic, and this doesn't come from the conclusion, it comes from the introduction section. And they said that a new coronavirus was identified as the causative agent of this unexplained pneumonia in January 2020. Now, this is a very bold statement. This is reference number 7. It doesn't say anything about causation anywhere. In the introduction, it says a novel coronavirus is associated with human-to-human transition and severe human infection. So once again, association is not causation. And in its conclusion, it talks about potential association. So in other words, there's some kind of association, we need more research, we haven't proven anything. They gave a reference, and it's not in the reference. This is a serious ethical violation here to make such an important claim. All of the world policies are based upon this claim that it is a causative agent, and they cannot reference any science to back that up whatsoever. And rumors and lies placed COVID-19 as the cause of a pandemic with no proof whatsoever.
Do doctors read these papers?
Well, doctors in general don't read any papers, and many of them actually don't know how to read a paper. The important point is that the way the system sets you up to be a doctor is that the only way to make a living for almost all doctors is to see large volumes of patients really, really quickly. Some doctors even see one patient every 6 minutes, so they can have 10 in an hour. Now, if you're this busy trying to just make a living, when are you going to have the time to sit down and read an article? So what usually happens is that there are services for doctors, like for example Medscape, which curates articles. Of course, they choose which ones to curate. And they put little blurbs, like basically the title in one sentence. And they're pretty much just summarizing the conclusions. So the doctors see this and then they assume that what is stated in the title of the article or in these short bullet points is actually valid. Whereas if they would read the papers, they would find that that's not the case at all.
Now, if you say, why don't you just show me the teeming particles in the lung fluid of the sick person, they say things like, well, there's not enough virus to find in the lung fluid, which then begs the question of there's not enough virus to find, what makes you think it's going to kill us all? They say that this is a wrong way of thinking because viruses are only intracellular pathogens, meaning you obviously, silly Tom, can't find loose viruses, free viruses, because they're all only inside the cell. And so you could only find them by looking at cells. It has to get free in order to be transmissible. That's what they say.
The classic techniques used to purify so-called viruses associated with microorganisms is generally done with what's called a density gradient ultracentrifugation. And that's when you just put different sugar solutions in a test tube with the more dense ones at the bottom of the tube, and you add your sample, and it spins around really fast and separates things by their density. So all the viral particles of the same variety will have the same density, and they'll form a very tight band in your test tube, and you'll be able to extract that in its purified state.
This is isolation. You separate it from everything else. But they don't. What they are saying, it's an isolation when they are able to induce an effect in the test tube. Induce an effect in the test tube.
The so-called virus isolation experiments are the experiments that are used to prove the existence of all pathogenic viruses.
Hey man, look at the dead cell fragments I created by starving and poisoning the cells in the culture.
Let's call them viruses and say that they were created by a virus that hijacked the cells.
And we'll call this virus isolation.
It's a process of decay. What we are thinking, we are studying life with our cell cultures, is a process of decay, of time.
So what exactly is a tissue culture?
A tissue culture is a way to grow cells artificially in a laboratory.
What kind of tissue do they use?
Well, they use a variety of different cells, but the most common are what's called vero cells, which are the kidney cells from a monkey.
So the vero cells are more or less taking place for the healthy human cells, right?
Yes, they would be like mimicking tissue that would be infected by the virus. Isn't it interesting that they say that this virus infects the lungs of humans? So why wouldn't they use lung cells from humans? They did use lung cancer cells in one experiment, but those were cancerous cells.
So then they add antibiotics, gentamicin to be specific?
Now this is interesting because the justification is that it will prevent bacterial contamination of the experiment. However, bacteria are much, much larger and can easily be separated by simply putting the sample through a filter. The antibiotics are toxic to cells, just like they're toxic to microorganisms. And in these experiments where almost all of them use monkey kidney cells, they also use specific antibiotics that are known to be toxic to kidney cells. So this essentially acts to poison the cell culture, and if is not the main factor, it certainly is a strong contributing factor for the damage that is seen and said and attributed to be from viruses.
So we have vero cells and we have antibiotics. What about the bovine fetal calf serum?
This process of dying you can only slow down with fetal sera. Sera from fetal human being, from fetal mammals. I mean, incredible. Only then the decay is slowed down. And only with this they can do their cell culture work. Without those fetal sera, they would immediately go into decay.
So why is it said that the cultures are starved?
It does not have the full complement of nutrition. So it would be like us being on a special modified diet, a low-calorie diet or a bread and water diet or an elimination diet, something that will keep us alive but will not make us optimally healthy.
So the culture's now basically toxic and starved. Now what happens?
Well, in these so-called virus isolation experiments, which are really tissue culture experiments, they add the body fluid from a person who is alleged to be sick with this illness caused by an alleged virus. They add that to the cell culture. And then they show that over time, the cells in the cell culture become damaged. and disintegrate into particles, as all damaged and dying cells do, but they say that it's caused by a virus. Now, since there are many, many things in the body fluid from a sick person, how do we know that one of those other things besides a virus, which, by the way, we don't even know there's a virus in there for sure, we only have suspicion, how do we know it's not one of those other components? Because we're talking about fluid from a dead and dying part of the body that's diseased.
So now that the sample is in the culture flask, do they just wait to see what happens?
They watch it until they get what they call cytopathic effects, which are changes in the shape of the cells that they can see under the microscope that indicate the cells are damaged and dying.
Why the tissues and cells are dying in the test tube? Because they are intoxicated with highly toxic antibiotics. They starve to death because they are reducing the nutritions, and that's the reason why it's dying in the test tube.
In the virology literature, the word isolate, they once again invert the meaning, and instead of separate from other things, what they mean is add to more things. So in other words, increase the complexity of the mixture rather than purify out a single component so you can study it.
So Andy, why don't they just look at the cell culture by itself and see if those monkey kidney cells die before they put any sample from anybody in there?
Well, it would overturn the whole virus theory. That would upset huge commercial interests. The pharmaceutical industry would be crushed because vaccines are a huge portion of their revenue.
Can we get some context for pricing, like say per gallon?
A gallon of gas, $4.13. A gallon of organic milk, roughly $7. A gallon of injection, a little harder to calculate as the costs fluctuate, currently set at pandemic prices, expected to go up soon. Currently, a gallon costs around $100,000. Where the price will settle is an unknown.
So Pfizer's CFO Frank D'Amelio openly states that the average vaccine costs between $150 to $175 per dose.
The study of viruses and virology is especially surprising because they don't use some of the most basic scientific methods to make sure that you don't confuse the meaning of the results. For example, they don't use control experiments.
So their own conditions, which they never controlled with control experiments, are the cause that the cells and tissues, the test tubes, are dying.
So what about the, quote, virus photos we see?
When you actually see microscope pictures, a lot of those are computer-generated images, CGI, to depict what they think or imagine a particular virus looks like. Now, when you actually see real photographs under the microscope, very often what you're looking at is cell debris, particles of cells that are broken down, damaged, or in some different phase of activity that is actually being used by the body for certain purposes.
This is very exciting information which we explore in part 2. Meanwhile, what are the different types of microscopy?
If we're using conventional methods, we stain slides, and depending on the type of microscope and the type of resolution, we'll see different things. For instance, in normal histological studies, you'll put on stains to bring out certain elements. Live cell microscopy, which is what I've done all these years, it allows you to see things in their alive state. Now, the resolution isn't anywhere near an electron light microscope, but at the same time, you see things in their alive state.
And the electron microscope?
The electron microscope is not photographing life. You have to kill the tissue, spread it on a slide, and stain it with a metallic dye, because what the microscope picks up is metal. It doesn't pick up tissue.
Here's how you get an electron microscope picture. You take some living tissue, and then you macerate it like in a blender. and then you freeze it to 150 degrees, and then you stain it with heavy metal stains, and then you put enzymes in it, and then you shoot it with an electron beam which evaporates everything, and then you see a two-dimensional picture.
So what is seen is dead. That seems significant.
In a living body, whether it's an animal or a human, there are a myriad of feedback systems that are all working congruously with each other, including a very elaborate communication system with the external environment that's keeping that homeostatic mechanism going the entire time. And if you take a few cells out of a body, put it into an in vitro contrived situation, that has nothing to do with a real body in real life. You're eliminating all these other factors. I'm not saying there's maybe not a time and place for those kinds of studies and that maybe we can't learn something, but no way on earth are you going to be able to make sense out of that and directly translate that into a living body with a consciousness, animal or human. It's really silly.
So like a ribosome is always a perfect circle, which can't possibly be after something was put in a blender. You know, even if it was a perfect circle on a two-dimensional picture means it was a sphere in real life. And if you put an orange in a blender, it's never going to make perfect circles.
This is a good time to raise the issue of artifacts.
A defect in an image that appears as a result of the technology and methods used to create and process the image. Dyes, for example, can and do create artifacts.
Heavy metal stains displace the molecules that you're looking at in the sample. So you're not actually seeing a protein or a membrane. What you're seeing is heavy metals in the block of tissues that you're looking at. It's almost as if you're looking at the shadow of an object rather than the object itself. You're trying to learn from the shadow without having the real thing.
When you see the halo around the micrograph of the supposed coronavirus,
You don't see a halo, you see black dots within the circle.
Okay.
And those have been actually identified as a human protein called clathrin. They're in the kidneys, they're in the lungs. That protein is sort of ubiquitous.
Is that the corona thing that they call?
Those are the spikes.
The spikes. So they're not a spike protein?
They are not a spike protein.
What is a spike protein?
Spike protein, best we can figure, is some protein that's attached to a certain sequence that has been synthesized in a laboratory. And the virus is basically the cover story or the patsy. Essentially, they made a protein that has a certain homology with another protein called syncytin, which is found like in ovaries and testicles and uterus and blood vessels. And it seems to be similar to that protein, although they changed it a little bit. And so they made it into basically a toxin. And then they're trying to inject a sequence of RNA to make you make that toxin. And then I think they figured somebody might say, hey, where did I get that toxin from? And so they'll say, well, you got it because you had a virus. And the virus has that protein on it. So the coronavirus is the patsy, or the spike protein. And then they inject you with a sequence to make you make it. Why? Because the coronavirus has it, and so that's what gets you immune to the coronavirus. It's a brilliant story.
It really is. So this is what they were doing in those gain of function labs when...
Probably. They bamboozled the entire, quote, anti-vax community. Not surprising.
Well, that's part of the genius of the plan.
Yes. Nobody should think these people are stupid.
So what happened in Wuhan?
What they did was they took fluid from people who were sick, a very, very small number of patients, like 1, 2, 3, 4. These people had some kind of atypical pneumonia. What they tell us about how viruses cause disease is that they come and invade, and then they use our host cells, like our human lung cells, if it's a lung infection, to make more virus particles. And they make so many inside our lung cells that our lung cells explode and then release, millions of virus particles. And all of those spread to other lung cells and cause the same thing. So you would think if that process was really what was happening, if you pull out that lung fluid and look under the microscope, you're just going to see tons and tons of virus bodies or virus particles. And they should all look identical, and they're all freshly made as part of this infection. But that's not what happens at all. They don't even look in the fluid for any virus bodies. It's kind of astounding, actually.
That's absolutely correct. And it's also not the first time. We don't look for the virus in the blood of AIDS patients. We don't look for the virus in the exudate from lesions from measles patients.
Instead, what they do is they have a test, a PCR genetic test. It's not really a test, it's actually a research tool. And what it allows them to do is amplify pieces of DNA that are present in only tiny, tiny amounts, like a needle in the haystack. And this technique, PCR, can make that one needle turn into 1 million needles. They take this lung fluid, right, which has all kinds of DNA and RNA and genetic material in it, human cells of various types, maybe extracellular particles. There's bacteria, many different species of bacteria in your lungs, or fungi, all different kinds of things, including all these sequences that they say are virus sequences present in our body all the time. Now, what are the sequences they're looking for? Well, they're actually predetermined. They have a computer database that has all of these sequences that they all determined. So with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, they said, well, this respiratory illness, it's just like SARS was, right? Which SARS was the outbreak in 2003 that they said was also associated with a novel coronavirus, the so-called SARS-CoV-1. And guess what? They found some sequences, but they were only about 80% similar to the old SARS virus. But nonetheless, they said, you know what? That's good enough. We'll just put aside the fact that humans and chimpanzees are 98% similar in their sequences, and these only being 80%, they'll still call them the same thing.
So they examined lung fluid from sick people with a PCR test which finds sequences. Where did the first sequence originate? I mean, don't they need something to compare new sequences to? They claim that these are genomic sequences, but if they never isolated anything from an organism, what is going on?
They don't actually have the genome of an organism. What they have is a computer model of a theoretical genome of a theoretical organism that hasn't been proven.
It's a mental construct nowadays done with huge computer programs, because they have a huge number of smaller molecules adding up to each other.
Before we dive in here, it makes sense to build a little foundational understanding to better comprehend next-generation sequencing.
You've heard that we have genes, and what a gene is, it's just a code of letters that basically specify a specific molecule. Okay, and that molecule is usually a protein, and it has a specific function. The code that makes up the genes has 4 letters or 4 bases, and it's a combination of those 4 letters that goes into the sequence.
Also known as nucleotides or base pairs.
C's are always paired with G's, and A's are always paired with T's, but the order of the very long sequence is, unique to that organism being sequenced.
Hello, spit. Thank you.
All this information is stored in chromosomes, and the totality of all this information is called its genome.
According to modern science, the human genome is so long that if unraveled, would go to the moon and back 150,000 times.
For this so-called viral genome, they didn't start with one long strand because this organism was never shown separately. They never took the genetic material out of the body of it and sequenced it from one long strand. They started with 20,000 little short strands that could be from a new organism, or could be from the human cells, or could be the bacteria, or could be this, or could be that, or could be the other thing.
They never ever find a whole piece, what could be even a gene. They find much shorter pieces in their decaying tissues.
My name is Marcelina Cravat. Just call me Einak.
And then from the sequences of a huge amount of smaller pieces, they are going to make an alignment and add them up.
How the heck are you going to put those into one long strand? So this is where the magic comes in that really creates the fraud. They're using computer modeling software. It puts all these 20,000 sequences in and tries to basically create a jigsaw puzzle that is complete out of it. Some of these 20,000 little sequences match up, like the end of one matches the end of the other, and you can put them together.
And then they believe, adding up the smaller pieces to a bigger one, oh, we have the genetic material. But it's not there. The sequence they are using for the alignment itself never originated out of a virus. It's also a mental product.
They created over 3 million possible genomes. And then they just picked the longest one, and then they compared it to a bat SARS-like coronavirus, which was also sequenced by the same procedure. And they said it was about 80% similar, so that means it must be the real thing. And then they used that bat coronavirus as a template to take things out, put them in, rearrange things from the strand that they got from the computer program. And once they made it look like the bat virus, they said, here it is. There is the in silico genome, or computer-generated theoretical genome.
Do these pieces align perfectly? What do they do if there are gaps?
Well, essentially, they just fill it in with sequences that they get from a computer database, from some other experiment.
In reality, they construct something which is not there. It's a pure mental product without any base in reality.
So, Jason, does your family have a secret family recipe?
Of course, every family's got a secret family recipe.
Well, ours is chocolate cake.
Yum, are you sharing?
Yes, of course.
Uh-oh.
Hold on, we'll put them together.
Combine every weathered crack and bony flake. Keep in pot, overheat, and add toasted teddy bears and elegant show horse. Separate after the floodwaters recede. Decide to fold in most of the other characters and ideas. As expected, serves 10. Delicious.
Quite a recipe. Quite a recipe. But, this simple analogy actually is quite accurate. It's not, perfect, because there are more letters in the alphabet than there are in the genetic code, but it's really a strong analogy, not far off from the truth at all. This theoretical genome that was constructed actually is the process for virtually all viral genomes. They never start with actually a known organism. Like, for example, when they developed the PCR test for COVID, they actually didn't even use a sequence from the COVID virus. They went back and used a sequence from SARS-CoV-1, or the SARS outbreak in 2003. It was Drosten, of course, who picked out a sequence from there and just said, well, whatever's happening now has got to be just like that, so we'll just use that. And it was never even modified after that. So what we have here is a real mess of theoretical computer-generated junk.
If they could find this virus in you at all, and with PCR, if you do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody. It starts making you believe in the sort of Buddhist notion that everything is contained in everything else, right? I mean, because if you can amplify one single molecule up to something that you can really measure, which PCR can do, then there's just very few molecules that you don't have at least one single one of them in your body. Okay.
The PCR test is being used as a tool to propagate fear in the population, where they can get as many cases by the number of tests that are done, and people are fearful that they are going to be affected by COVID-19. The PCR can amplify specific target genetic sequences very well, but unfortunately, many people forget that this is all that it does. It doesn't prove the existence of an alleged organism, and it certainly doesn't tell you if you are infected with something.
A PCR procedure, and I'm not even going to call it a test, is a way to amplify genetic material. Now, when this is falsely applied as a diagnostic test, you can easily manipulate different parts of the procedure to get a different outcome. So, for example, if you want to create more positive results, you can adjust these parameters one direction, and if you want to get less or fewer positive results, you can adjust it the other direction.
They're looking for a particular sequence from what they've done already with the genomic sequencing. If you went in and looked for any sequence, they would potentially find it. They'd find some similar sequence. So that's why it's very manipulable.
There's a principle in science. If you look specifically for something, you're likely to find it. Whereas if you just observe what's happening, you're much more likely to see the actual reality and truth.
If there was a new test for diabetes and we were suddenly exposed to it and everyone was getting tested, we would be terrified of diabetes, and possibly we should be, because type 2 diabetes is a much more serious condition. So say, for example, instead of strokes, now there was a new virus that was causing a condition just like strokes that was called virus X, and we were testing for it all the time. We would be terrified that we're going to catch this virus X and this is going to cause something similar to a stroke.
What we saw during this pandemic was essentially a relabeling of the cause of death. And this was brought about principally by the false or invalid PCR test, because that was the main tool used to identify cases. And of course, in the past, having an illness meant you were sick, but now it just means having a PCR test. So if you died of any cause and had a PCR test that was positive, now they would attribute your death to COVID. So we saw, for example, there were 1,000 times fewer deaths from influenza in the first pandemic year compared to the previous year. There were also major reductions in all the other causes of death, like heart disease, cancer, etc. The only areas where there was an increase in numbers was drug overdoses and suicide.
Area medical teams say hospitals have not been overwhelmed by COVID-19 cases, but they have been surprised by something else, a sharp rise in suicides.
The numbers that we've seen are sort of unprecedented. We've never seen numbers like this in such a short period of time. I mean, we've seen a year's worth of suicide attempts in the last 4 weeks.
The trauma team here says they are mostly seeing young adults die by suicide. They are worried about the mounting effects of loneliness and job loss as this quarantine continues.
The social isolation has a price.
Jason, another huge thing that seems to have gone overlooked is the striking similarity this whole fear-demic has with the AIDS epidemic.
Yes, more or less a template of death diagnosis with fraudulent tests, with the same players in charge. This topic deserves a whole episode.
There was no new disease, but simply a new test, in that case the so-called HIV antibody test. In 1 week, people were being diagnosed with conditions such as tuberculosis, and the next week they were said to have HIV infection because their blood was positive for HIV antibodies. And for COVID-19, the same pattern has happened. And to this day, there are no specific clinical features or investigations outside of the PCR that make up the diagnosis of COVID-19. And this has been pointed out in a Cochrane collaboration review. So there is no evidence of a new condition. We simply have a new PCR test. When people realise that a positive PCR test doesn't have any validity, it literally is meaningless, everything else unravels, because then there are no conditions of COVID-19 and there's no need for treatment with vaccines or preventative treatment. It is simply a PCR test pandemic, and the cure is to stop using these tests, which are not fit for purpose.
Well, Jason, it sure looks like we've got an awful lot riding on a theory.
Well, theories can be perceived as a lifeline when fear is the motivating force.
Mm-hmm.
And that science has not to date ever isolated a virus taken from a sick organism is a fact.
Right. I hope people will really start to understand the responsibility of consent.
It is the only thing that makes this global nightmare real.
Meanwhile, we've got a lot more to cover. So after a little break, let's keep on going. But first, we do have an announcement.
Okay, so to me, I personally feel it's everyone's responsibility. If you understand something and it is for the greater good of all of us, it is our responsibility to pass that on to others. We can take our flame, our torches that we are all holding of this knowledge, and light other torches as we go along. This is something that we must do.
Thank you for our freedom. Basilico. We hope more people will follow suit.
Very good food.
This is about exercising our liberty and our freedoms.
But the freedom is what brought me here.
You gotta take off your mask though.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, you gotta take it off. Yeah. You gotta take it all the way off. There you go. There you go. Enjoy. You know, I didn't pick this fight. You know, they did. I don't call it civil disobedience, what I'm doing here. I don't call it a resistance either, because we're attacking the enemy. You're not gonna win by being quiet about it. A lot of businesses out there that think that they're fighting, and they do it by having a side door open. That's not how you fight. You fight openly. There's no way in hell that I'm shutting anything down.
You rock, Tony. One thing that is consistent, despite the wide range of experiences, is that they all stem from understanding that something is wrong. Very wrong. Where's the mainstream media that should be reporting on this? Absent.
I think we are, each of us in our own way, working out what sovereignty looks like. If we're stuck in our childlike psychology, then we have a tendency to idealize authority because we're so merged that there's no possible way that authority could ever actually truly mean us harm. And it is the rupture of that idealization, which is itself the projected, what's called the good object, that we haven't owned yet. And we fuse with this parentified authority, and all of our self-judgment that we're not looking at gets projected on other people, right? So these are often the highly compliant citizens who are deputized to, you know, make sure that other citizens are doing their part to be good and do the right thing.
Hello, officer. I think you're here to see me.
I'll talk to you outside.
I'd rather stay in here. These guys are not letting me.
No, you can leave that right here. I'll talk to you outside. And you can film still. That's fine.
Why can't I purchase the merchandise?
If they don't want you here, then
but
they
this is
ask you to leave.
They have open to the public.
Yep.
I didn't violate any law.
Okay, but if they don't want you in here,
I have a medical condition that exempts me from wearing a mask.
Okay, then show them to me outside.
Well, I don't have to prove anything to you.
Why are you shaking so bad about this?
I'm a little nervous talking to a police officer.
Okay. Well, this isn't a big deal, so let's talk about it outside. If they don't want you here, you're trespassing. Right.
Well, no, this isn't private property. I have a public right of way.
It's not private property?
They open their door to the public.
Okay, but they don't want you here.
That creates a public right of way. They can't just choose who to serve and who not to serve. It's discrimination.
So, sir, do you want to be escorted out?
I don't want to be escorted out.
Okay, then put your stuff here and talk to me outside.
You're supposed to protect my rights.
Yep, and that's what I'm doing right now, so that's why I want to talk to you outside.
I feel like this officer is not really respecting my position. He's going to force me not to come back in after this.
Perfect.
So can I just have your name and badge?
Yes, we'll get it outside. We're going to do that outside.
MF Fuel, UHL.
Up here, you want it? You can have it. Let's go.
2920. Hey, don't push me. Don't push me.
Hey, stop pushing me. Outside. You're not coming outside.
You don't have a reason to use force.
I didn't use force. Believe me, if I used force, you would know.
No store can make a policy that violates the law.
Okay, sir, do you have any idea that we're in an epidemic?
No city can make a policy that violates the law.
That's why they don't want you in here. Understand? That's why I'm wearing this, that's why he's wearing his.
I
Right?
understand that the executive order has an exemption for people who are unable to tolerate a mask.
Then where's your exemption?
I'm telling you,
You don't have any proof, is what you're saying.
What do you mean? What kind of proof do I need?
I need something that says...
Why do you need that?
Because you're saying that you have some sort of disorder that you can't
Listen,
put a mask on.
I said I'm unable to medically tolerate a mask, which is what it says.
Okay,
in the
what's her
executive order.
problem?
She's just filming for me.
Oh, so you staged this whole thing?
No, I'm not staging this.
Seems like it.
I want to have evidence that I was treated appropriately and that my rights were respected.
Okay.
That's all.
Okay, this is private property. If they don't want you here, then you can't be here.
So aren't you aware that when a store opens their doors to a public,
But they
have a public right of way. They can't.
Okay, and you're aware that you own a house, and if you don't want someone there, we have to come remove them.
I don't open the doors of my house to the public.
Well, I'm just
for business.
Okay.
Once they open the door to, I swear this is the law. You can check with your superior if you're unaware of this.
They don't want you here.
It doesn't matter if they want me to. They're discriminating against me.
No, what's it say right there on the window?
They can ban you from the store for not following the rules. I understand. So what if they put up a rule there that you needed to carry your shotgun to be admitted.
Right, but
if
awesome.
I didn't have
Awesome.
a shotgun, they couldn't let me in.
That's
without
awesome.
A shotgun?
That's a great example.
So if I went in there without a shotgun, they could kick me out under those circumstances?
That's not a state mandate. This is a state mandate.
I am told you I'm complying with the state executive order. I have an exemption.
Okay, where's your exemption?
What do you mean, where is it?
Where's your
It's
note
in
from
my
your
body.
Where's your note from your doctor saying that
I don't need to share my personal health
Oh,
information.
you
with
do,
It's
because
protected-
everybody that walked in the store could
it's
say the same
protected
thing.
by
Do
HIPAA.
you not understand that?
Right in the law, it says in the guidance from the health department, it says that I do not have to divulge my health condition. I can show you on the webpage.
Well, if you're not going to comply with the
The
order,
health
then you do
department.
have to divulge your health condition. Otherwise, everybody would go around saying that they have a condition they can't wear a mask. Do you understand what I'm saying there?
Your health privacy.
Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Does that not?
Officer, your health information is protected by federal law as private.
Okay,
you
that's
do not
fine.
have to prove to anyone that you have a health condition.
But if you're not going to comply with an order,
No,
then
even
you
if I'm not, I am in compliance. I have an exemption.
What's it say right there on the door, sir? Just read that to me. on
That
the
is
door.
not law.
What's it say on the door, though?
It is law.
What if they put on the door that you had to wear
So
lipstick
can you not
to
read?
enter?
Can you not read it? What's it say on the door?
I can read.
Okay,
I'm
what does
very
it say?
well
I'm
educated,
asking you. What's
as
it
you
say?
can tell.
I'll read it to you. All customers are required to wear a mask, covering both mouth and nose when entering the store.
Officer,
Were you doing that?
What if they
Were
put
you
on
doing
their-
that? You're not answering any of my questions. Were you doing that?
No, I was
No.
not doing that.
Okay.
What if they put on there you had to wear lipstick to enter?
Okay.
Would you be here kicking me out if I wasn't wearing lipstick?
No,
in
but
that
we're not in
condition?
fantasy land either, okay?
I'm not in fantasy
What if
land
everybody
either.
walked in the store and
Tell
said,
me,
I'm not
you
wearing a mask
listen,
because I have a
what-
health
is
condition?
it your job
No, answer
to
that.
is your job to enforce the law?
I am.
Tell me, what law am I violating?
The
What's the
executive
code
order
of
that
it?
says
Right now,
you
they
can
don't
That's
want
not-
you here, so you're
executive order is
trespassing.
not a law. It's not
How's
passed
that?
by the legislature. You have no authority to uphold an executive order.
Okay, then you can go talk
So
to your local
tell me
legislator
what
about
law that I'm violating.
You're trespassing. You're not complying with the store
You can't-
policy. So therefore, you can't be in the
Okay.
store.
Are you just
Can
here
I-
to
Can I ask
to
you who
make
your,
this point?
who your superior
Or try to make a
officer-
point?
Can I ask you who your superior officer
Yes, sure.
is?
Chief Johnson.
Chief
Go
Johnson.
drive right down to the police station.
Okay. Do you have a phone number for Chief Johnson?
Why don't you just drive down there and talk to him? You'll need a mask.
Where is he?
He's at the police station.
Okay. It's down the road that way?
Yes.
Okay, I will do that.
Perfect.
All right. May I go on my way now?
What's your last name, sir?
I don't want to tell you that.
Oh, why not?
Why would I?
Well, it's an investigation. Don't you want your voice heard?
Did I break the law?
I'm going to document that this happened.
Are you detaining me?
Don't you want this documented?
Okay, let's go, Lauren.
These stores that are telling you that you can't come in, they are breaking the law. And when they tell you that it's their store policy, it doesn't make it lawful.
Oh, this is your truck? I'll just get it from this.
The government knows that it can't make these laws, so it's using the stores
It's all right. We can.
as the law enforcement to do so by design.
Wow, you got to dance around like
You know, it would really help if you take off the mask.
Have fun leaving, guys.
But I'm outside.
The governor made a law, the governor's new law, the governor's mandate. It is not possible. It is not possible, and it did not happen.
Thanks for fighting for our rights, officer. Great job.
The Constitution was created to prevent the government from trampling on our rights. The governor, the president, these are executives. They enact the laws that the legislature created. Every government that proclaimed an emergency, whether it's the state, whether it's the county, whether it's the city, is eligible for CARES Act funds. But the fact of the matter is, this CARES Act money was supposed to go to small businesses that were hurting because they closed down. In my county, there are 5 supervisors, and the supervisor that oversees our region, instead of giving that money directly to the small businesses, she hired an administrator to study how that money should be distributed. And it turned out that instead of the businesses getting $10,000, $15,000, they would get $1,000 that they could apply for in a grant if they posted a sign on their window that said they were going to enforce masks.
Go read Article 6, Clause 2 of the federal Constitution. It's called the Supremacy Clause. The federal Constitution is supreme. It's the law of the land. It trumps state constitutions, and it trumps all municipal corporation ordinances and statutes and codes. The local stuff from the state down can never supersede the federal Constitution. Everything was created under the federal Constitution. Government was created for only one reason, and people don't understand this: to protect rights. That's it. They look like they're protecting rights right now. Doesn't look like they're protecting rights. Looks like they're trampling them right now. And they're doing that because the people have been dumbed down. They don't understand their rights. They don't know how to enforce their
Mayor
rights.
Bill de Blasio announcing an expansion of his vaccine mandate across the Big Apple earlier this week. The new mandate requires vaccines for all private sector workers without a testing option and requires children ages 5 to 11.
God, look how quickly this spun out of control from just them using a claim that there's a virus out there. Look what they've done to people.
Yes, let's take a look at what they've done to people. The Public Health and Medical Professionals for Transparency put in a Freedom of Information request for Pfizer's post-marketing data regarding their vaccine, but it was denied. So they sued the FDA, and now the document is available to those who care to seek it out.
This is a Pfizer internal document, proprietary and confidential. This covers the first 2.5 months of data. And if you look in the lower right-hand corner, I'll move my cursor to that area, 1,223. That is the number of fatalities reported by people who received the Pfizer vaccine. The swine flu vaccine in the 1970s, that was taken completely off the market after only 50 suspicious deaths.
Within this document, there are 8 pages of injuries and deaths reported.
Acute disseminated encephalomyelitis is an acute swelling of the brain and spinal cord. Cardiac ventricular thrombosis, that's a blood clot inside the heart. Now, this is an amazingly exhaustive list.
How on earth is the public not absolutely livid over this? I mean, because they don't know, that's why. The media
That's exactly right. This has not been disseminated in the mainstream media. It's been suppressed. So this is the kind of information that is available to those who want to know the truth.
It is also the kind of information that would be admissible in a court of law, and for those getting fired from jobs, it might be worth the time to learn about your constitutional rights and the law.
Corporations are acting like tribunals, like they're courts. Basically, they're making medical determinations for people, they're making legal determinations for people, and they don't have that authority to do that. And when the attorney from the company writes you and tells you you've got to have a vaccination, well, we're going to go file bar grievance against that attorney. And we may file state criminal complaints against that attorney because he's exerting acts of ownership and title. He can't make legal determinations on his own by stating you've got to be tested, you've got to wear a mask, and you've got to have a vaccine. And what's going to happen is those agencies we file with, they're going to protect them people. You're never going to see anybody even get a slap on the wrist by you filing that stuff. But here's what you don't know, and this is the stuff that people need to understand. Anytime you file something against a public official or against somebody in a company, your boss, they got to tell the insurer. The insurer wants to know what's going on so that all of a sudden somebody doesn't turn around and looking at a $100 million suit that the insurer's got to pick up. Even though these administrative agencies aren't going to do anything, the insurance companies are going to get notified. And we've seen more judges pull out of cases, attorneys pull out of cases, and policies change the companies because people have done this. Now, if one person does that, they're going to take notice. But if 10, 15, or 20 did that within a company, they're definitely going to take notice.
Unfortunately, the collective is choosing victimhood, mental illness.
So it's gone past just a kind of state of crazy fear intoxication, and it's evolved now into a more calm and more thoughtful self-segregation, similar to the Jewish star or to a tattoo. And that makes a statement that I am in the in-group and you are not.
Yeah!
The more the self-identification process with the masks and all this distancing nonsense becomes absurd, the more clearly self-segregated, confident, and reassured people inside of that cult become. They're not thinking about how they're perceived by those that are outside the cult. They couldn't care less. What they care about is separating themselves as far away as possible from the actual reality.
What we see happening right now is a captured population, a good percentage of it, that have fallen prey to these tactics. And so they are not able to embody the purity of spirit. They are literally mind controlled.
A woman came to me yesterday and she said, I have an 8-year-old child in LAUSD, Los Angeles Unified School District. He said to me after school that one of his friends was brought to the front of the class and the teacher said, Davey has something he wants to announce to the class. Davey, would you please make your announcement? Today, I went and got my vaccine. And the teacher said, little Davey got his vaccine because he wants to protect you and your parents and his brother and his sister. He's keeping us safe by getting his vaccine. Everyone in the class, please applaud. Now, what did the boy do when he came home and talked to his mother and related this story to her? He said, why won't you let me get the vaccine so that I can keep people safe? Now, what is the mother going to have to do now that the child has been turned against her by the teacher?
They are being told by people in a position of authority that this is the right thing to do. This is where evil sets in. Because the nature of evil is to take something that is good and to turn it around and say that it's bad. And that's something that is bad to turn that around and to promote it as something good.
Encouraging and allowing children to wear masks is tantamount to child abuse. When you have children who can't be near to one another physically and are unable to breathe and unable to see each other's faces, see each other's facial expressions, you are preventing their development from taking place. In early development, infants learn how to recognize human faces and what emotions are by seeing exaggerated expressions on the face of the mother all day long, and other mothers and other women and adults, just anybody really. They're missing out on that critical period of neural development. We don't have any idea what's going to happen because this has never been done before. We have never blocked the ability of an entire generation of children, of babies, to see human faces for 12 months. This has never been done.
We're social beings. We need affection. We need touching. It's healing. It keeps us emotionally healthy. It keeps us related. The social aspects of it, I think, is what is most difficult emotionally and psychologically for the children. I know from my own kids, when the lockdown first occurred, all of their close friends were no longer allowed to hang out with them. And this has continued since that point.
The psychological damage is going to be for a lifetime, in my opinion, in my professional opinion.
So we are now prevented from experiencing that. And when I get together with people who realize that these policies are detrimental, I mean, it's hugs galore. I mean, everybody wants to hug each other because they're so starved for it.
We can all see and feel the imbalance. It affects our collective consciousness and, of course, the health of the planet.
It also causes our individual internal terrain to suffer. In other words, we're not separate, but rather an integral part of nature.
Physically, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually.
The symptoms or the sufferings generally considered to be inevitable and incident to the disease
are very often not symptoms of the disease at all, but of something quite different, of the want of fresh air, or of light, or of warmth, or of quiet, or of cleanliness, or of punctuality and care in the administration of diet, of each, or of all of these.
Pleomorphism, that's the way nature's processes work. We go through predictable phases. You're going to see these little pinpoints get a little larger. When I look under the microscope, I'll see these organisms in different phases, and they tell me a lot about the internal ecology of the body. It gives me a lot of clues as far as why people are experiencing certain symptoms, but more importantly, it tells me what I can do to help realign those processes and eliminate symptoms. Protids, when you look in the blood and you see a lot of these little glimmering sparkles, they are a sign of good health. Now, they will go from a little point of light under the microscope into a more of a circular object, and we call that a colloid. From there are other phases. You'll enter into a bacterial phase that perhaps your doctor would culture if you have a strep throat or some such thing and say you have streptococcus. What they're not appreciating is that is a bacterial phase that they mistake for a distinct entity within nature that exists solely in that state, but it actually comes from an organism within us that we call penicillin notatum. From the bacterial phase, depending on the terrain, because remember, these organisms have certain functions and they also adapt to the environment like all of us have to. From there, it might go into what we'd recognize as a fungal phase and so forth. And if the body is recruiting these organisms to go into these phases for a particular function, then what will happen is if the terrain is in balance and has all the resources necessary, it's going to do its job, and then it's going to go full circle and revert back to its protid stage. Every stage of that cycle has a purposeful function to provide a service for the terrain. In those stages, they also produce enzymes and things that make us feel not that great, raise our temperature, inflame mucous membranes, make our body upchuck in different ways, but that's its purpose. And we erroneously label that as disease. And then if one of these organisms is found at the scene of the crime, then we say that created the disease. We take antibiotics. Sure enough, it dampens down that level of the cycle so that the symptoms disappear, but you impeded what it was trying to do for your longevity.
Is this not the same in nature? We don't say that a compost pile is infected when it's breaking down organic matter.
This is nature reduced down to its elements by the microscopic germs that they say make us sick. But this is ready to spring forth new life.
So you see these same processes going on in nature. And of course, when you find a dead animal in the forest and it's covered with fly larvae that are eating the carcass, nature's way of cleaning the forest floor, we don't say, oh, those darn flies killed another deer. It's silly.
So bacteria that are present in our inner terrain, is their excretion toxic to us?
If bacteria eat their normal food source, in other words, they're not eating diseased tissue or dead flesh, like for example, in our colon, in our gut, one of the foods the bacteria normally eat is fiber in our diet. And when they get a good amount of fiber and they're very healthy, they don't secrete any waste products that are going to be toxic to us. However, if we bombard them with toxic substances, like antibiotics, for example, well, they have toxic things in their cells. They're going to excrete them out, and then they could damage other tissue. But if we are not in a state of disease, then the secretions or excretions of the microorganisms is not going to be harmful or cause disease.
This really changes the way we look at disease, and it raises a lot of questions about contagion.
I've come to my own scientific, clinical, and personal understanding that contagion is actually a biologically unproven concept. Maybe there is some truth in the concept that, a virus is an expression of toxicity that actually can be spread through the mycelium of human connection to inspire, induce, and support the detoxing of other people, and that can look like contagion.
For example, when a plant is stressed or under drought conditions, it produces specific compounds, informational molecules, such as polyphenols, in order to transfer that information to the other plants in its group so that it can say, hey guys, I'm feeling this adversity coming. You guys need to activate resilience pathways.
Perhaps humans communicate through some sort of resonance field that for those in need, it is now time to detox. An annual natural cycle of renewal to remove built-up toxins in an imbalanced terrain.
So that might mean illness.
What we sometimes call influenza-like disease. Raising your temperature, you're sweating, you're eliminating, you're basically in a process of trying to clean house. It doesn't feel good, but ultimately it's there to generate an incredible regenerative effect. It's not to say there isn't risk involved in getting sick in this way. Some people are not going to make it. It's usually the elderly with multiple chronic diseases undergoing polypharmacy. Their detoxification pathways are shot. They aren't getting good nutrition. They don't have love in their field. And those individuals often pass on prematurely. People that are generally healthy are not as susceptible to seasonal influenza. They're not going to need that dramatic, heroic detoxification event. But those who do experience it are doing it so that they can actually clean house so they don't die suddenly of thrombosis or start developing cancer.
Nick Gonzalez told me about Keshin's disease observed in China, where cardiomyopathy was developing at seemingly epidemic rates in a certain region. And it was assumed reflexively to be infectious because that's what we're enculturated around. It's something bad that came in and did that, and it can be spread, and so we need to contain it. And ultimately, it was found to only be manifesting in regions with selenium-depleted soil, because the epidemiology of it wasn't really consistent with a seeming spread of a contagion. And so it prompted investigation, which should be the case. When there is a hole in a theory, the theory should be tabled.
So it is beginning to become clear that medicine is rife with theories. One builds upon another until we venture so far from the truth that the inclination to look for it escapes us.
An antibody is really a misnomer because it's part of a view of biology, that biology is a battlefield and that there are good guys fighting bad guys. But nature doesn't have good and bad guys. It only has self-correcting, self-balancing mechanisms. So when doctors say you have a virus, what they are basing that assumption on, and it is an assumption based on some theories, is an antibody test. And they will theorize that people with certain syndromes, if they find certain titers of antibodies prevalent in people's blood with those symptoms, then they will circumstantially blame those antibodies as attacking a virus they have theorized is causing the disease. AIDS, hepatitis C, Epstein-Barr, take your pick.
HIV. HIV and AIDS was the first global dogma. Every nation was under these things, everybody, And Corona is the second one, and I predicted it since long.
If you look back in medicine before HIV, antibody tests were essentially used to show that you were immune from an illness. And they were used heavily for vaccine-related immunity, but also natural immunity. So, for example, if you had the antibody to measles virus, it meant that you had already had the measles virus and had recovered, and now you have lifelong immunity. Now, when Bob Gallo invented the antibody test for HIV, another virus that doesn't exist, it totally changed how we interpret antibody tests. For the first time, now we were told that an antibody test meant that you had an illness rather than being immune from it. So almost the opposite of what we were told the meaning or significance of it was previously. And the same thing is true for the so-called antibody tests related to COVID.
Antibodies really aren't specific for a particular disease, and this is why they've been put forth to both say that someone is immune to a disease and also that someone has a disease. There just isn't that degree of specificity.
So exactly what is an antibody?
An antibody is a protein that at the tip of it has an area that non-specifically binds a range of different chemicals. And the way that antibodies are made in our body is that there's an incredible variety of different chemistry that goes into the variable ends here. But each particular antibody can bind a range of different substances. And the whole set of antibodies can practically bind any substance that might enter our body.
So what about the so-called immune system?
You know, one of the major flaws with modern medicine is that it's compartmentalized, that we just look at one particular part of the body or one particular system. But this is a false construct. We can't separate different compartments or parts of the body like the immune system. If your immune system is unhealthy, then your body is unhealthy. And if your body is healthy, then your immune system is healthy.
And genetics theory?
DNA reflects the blueprint. It is not the actual blueprint. It reflects the electrical vectors that put the DNA into a material form in the first place. So we're thinking of things entirely backwards when we say DNA determines our genetics, our body, our physiology, or anything about us.
The DNA, which seems to be in the nucleus primarily, acts essentially as an antenna. But it's not a double helix. The water is a double helix. The DNA is just the chemicals lining the double helix of the water.
By water, Tom is referring to the cell's gel-like water, or the cytoplasm, which surrounds the nucleus. This water is home to a lot of organelles, small like organs of the cell with important functions for our bodies, like making energy, for example.
The water is like your radio and turns inputs, light, sound, thoughts, emotions, radio waves, electromagnetic fields, chemicals, hormones, etc. Turns those inputs, if it's coherent, into proteins, no code required, and the proteins make up living systems. And that's how it works.
If we don't question these underlying fundamental theories of immunology, of genetics, of the cell architecture, then we're going to be further and further lost at sea, because each round of research and knowledge that is put forth in the mainstream is built upon a false premise. If we accepted the truth that germ theory is simply false and viruses don't cause disease, then we would not be misled, we would not be afraid that there is a weaponized virus that's been spread out into the world.
I wouldn't be surprised if they would like to create an engineered virus that would be transmissible and affect, millions and billions of people. I think there may be some interest in that. But the good news is it doesn't work like that. So you can't do it. You can make toxins and affect millions and billions negatively, but you can't make a transmissible virus because that's not how it works.
What about antibody-dependent enhancement?
Another dangerous narrative for two main reasons. Firstly, because it generates unnecessary and extreme amounts of fear. Many people who are talking about it are saying that millions of people who are vaccinated are going to die the next flu season. And then the second is because it keeps you believing in the narrative that viruses are dangerous because it's not the vaccine toxicity that's causing the problem. It has to be dependent on exposure to the deadly, dangerous virus. And then, of course, the scary fake variants. You wouldn't even have to look at the ridiculous evidence that they put forth. You would already know that it's completely false.
Andy, can I share a candid phone conversation we had about this?
Go ahead.
Let me ask you this, Marcy. You know how they say that there are these variants and that the variants are more transmissible or more severe?
Yeah.
They actually make in the laboratory what they call a pseudovirus. In other words, they take the gene sequence for this spike protein that they think is from a variant because of that genome sequencing bullshit, and they put it into a synthetic pseudovirus, the same technology as the vaccine. They essentially make a experimental vaccine with this mutated protein that they think comes from the variant. Then they infect it into a tissue culture, and then they mix antibodies. And then based on how the antibodies react with this pseudovirus that's artificially created in a laboratory, that's how they report that it's transmissible or it's severe. Now, why wouldn't they just use the virus? Why wouldn't they just take it out of all the people that are affected with the Delta and then do the antibody studies with that? Because it doesn't exist. That's why. But virologists don't talk with me, so I can ask them that question. But it's obvious. That's the answer. You know, you can't prove a negative. I can't prove to you that, you know, no one anywhere has never done a control experiment. But I can tell you that I've looked at several hundred virology papers where they've done this isolation procedure, and not one of them ever has a control. It's not supposed to be that you do a control with one experiment and then anytime you do the same procedure, you don't do a control. You're supposed to run a control every goddamn time. If I tried to get an article published and I didn't have a control group, they would have just sent it back to me right away and say, where's your control group? It's only in this narrow field that they even allow you to submit a paper without a control. Tom and I talked to actual academic scientists. They say the most ridiculous things, like this one guy who was actually at the Wuhan Institute in China. And he says, well, these virologists are so smart. I know that they're right. That's his argument. That's his scientific argument. We ask him, why can't you isolate the virus directly from a sick person? There's not enough. So I said, okay, well, what if you have 100 people? Will that be enough? What if you have 1,000? What about 10,000? And of course, he didn't even answer. He just was like,
Are doctors and medical students encouraged to think critically?
Unfortunately, critical thinking within medical schools doesn't really exist. When you go to med school, you have to take on the dogmas that are taught to you. Otherwise, you won't pass your exams. If you talk about another idea like terrain theory, you will be laughed at.
A friend of mine, a specialist in nucleic acid, he was questioning me why I did talks and education on HIV and AIDS, because I was a full believer in this concept. And he asked me if I checked the evidence. I got a red face immediately because I realized I didn't check it. I believed it.
This is actually an incredible moment of realization that Dr. Lanka has shared with us. One of the hardest things for people to accept is that perceived authorities may just be regurgitating what they've been led to believe.
How can all these incredibly smart people have got it so wrong, particularly the last 150 years, but it actually goes way back? It's very simple. They started with a premise. Only physical substance exists. We're not basically substance. The substance is the end result of the process of water interacting with energy fields. Once you get that wrong, Everything else is wrong. Everything. So it's not a matter of, well, I'm criticizing that they got some things wrong. No, they got everything wrong. The whole way of looking at it is flat out wrong.
Louis Pasteur started us on this merry-go-round that just keeps devolving not only our biological integrity, but also our level of consciousness that has been dampened down on so many levels.
Glorified as the father of germ theory, Pasteur's published diaries reveal fraud, the falsifying of results, plagiarism, ties to French aristocracy, and, interestingly, he was said to have recanted germ theory on his deathbed in a letter to contemporary Claude Bernard. Fast forward to the 1950s.
John Enders won the Nobel Prize for coming up with an easier way of manufacturing a polio vaccine.
But, and this is a big but, he discovered during his experiments that the cell culture died without any sick sample added. Remember the virologist's isolation experiment? This actually was the first and only control experiment until Dr. Lonka's last April. The vaccine paradigm depends on this belief system, and virologists have never been permitted to question this. So Enders' findings were kept quiet. The Nobel Prize, no doubt, helped to that end. However, many are starting to wise up.
You've issued a series of FOIA requests asking for information. Give us the rundown of the scope of that and what specifically were you asking for?
In every request, I asked for records describing the isolation or purification of the alleged COVID-19 virus, which is called SARS-CoV-2. If you look at the so-called virus isolation papers, you'll find that they do other things that they call isolation. So they'll take a patient sample and they'll put it with some monkey kidney cells and fetal bovine serum and drugs, and they call that isolation. So I specified that's not what I'm talking about, and I'm not talking about PCR tests. I wasn't asking only for records of isolation done by that institution. It could be any record that they have in their custody or control, written by anybody in the world.
Like a university or someone receiving a government grant or anything?
Exactly. Because there are many research teams around the world that claim to have isolated the alleged virus. We now have responses from 137 institutions in over 25 countries. And no one to this day has provided even one record of the alleged virus having been purified from any patient sample on the planet by anyone.
The question has been asked, and what Christine has done is said, do you actually have proof that they found a virus and took it directly from nature and got it by itself so they could analyze it? Every single institution, every government, every agency, every organization, every university has replied that no, they simply do not have the evidence that this thing really exists.
I actually have some news to share. We actually started doing some freedom of information requests on other alleged viruses as well. From the CDC, they have no record of the alleged 2003 SARS virus having been purified. They have no record of any common cold coronavirus having been purified. They have no record of any HIV, any HPV, any influenza virus of any kind, any West Nile virus.
You got my attention and the attention of many people. You are uncovering what may be one of the greatest frauds in the history of Western science.
Children are particularly dangerous to stork populations.
Global warming is impacting cotton
New
production,
mandates require distancing from stork
Mask up
areas.
when near nesting areas.
meaning diaper shortages for stork baby deliveries.
The academic world is self-governing to a degree, but it's really controlled by the funding sources. So if you want to see whose interest is being served with academic research, with the mission of educating, you have to look where the money is. The largest funder of research is the federal government. The other big funder is the pharmaceutical and medical device industry. Obviously, they have a profit motive. So they're very happy with new viral diseases because each one of those is an opportunity to make a new antiviral drug. There's always been this business strategy to complement viruses with cancer because treating cancer is one of the most lucrative areas of medicine, and it's a huge annual industry in the United States. You could talk about it as a percentage of GDP. That's how big it is.
This is absolutely a fear-demic, and there is ample evidence, too, for anybody who does even cursory research that it is purposeful, a form of inducing compliance for other, let's just say, agendas.
This pandemic is not the end game, and money is not the end game. The end game is the control of the population. Whether that means eugenics, depopulation, I'm agnostic about that. I really don't know. But I do know that the control of the people is what everybody that has been lying to us and taking away our liberties is ultimately seeking. There is no example in history of a totalitarian state allowing free speech. None. So if the end goal, as I propose, of all of this pandemic nonsense is actually control, just as it is necessary to separate children from their parents to own the youth population, it is also necessary to block the dissemination of free information. Because you cannot control a population if you don't control speech and control the children. This is the historical reality throughout the 20th century of every single totalitarian government.
And epidemics play right into this, or should we say, through consent, they take hold.
To understand epidemics, you really have to step back and look at the big picture. For instance, the Spanish flu epidemic. Coincidentally, at that time, there was the introduction of a widespread electrical grid. When the herd makes an adaptation, it will go through a symptomatic phase, and then it will be followed by a period of adaptation, and then the species no longer portrays those particular symptoms.
If you're sick, for example, and you've been exposed to the toxicant burden we all are exposed to today, we have non-native EMF blasting us moment to moment, we have biologically incompatible foods, we have the psychogenicity of profound stress and trauma, our cells are going to be suffering, which then can lead to the production of extracellular vesicles like exosomes that contain information that may be alarming if you're exposed to it, may tell your partner that they need to activate detoxification pathways immediately because the information is being transferred to the herd so that there could be resistance within the community.
The problem is every time the herd has to make an adaptation, it's not quite as healthy because of it. It loses a little bit of its vitality and resilience. We have a greater abundance of vertical carrier waves, and those with them will carry other things into our biology, into our psyche, into our subconscious. For instance, we are being exposed to propaganda and simultaneously getting it from a source that is exposing us to these negative vertical waves. Those messages are going to create a resonance that then permeates on a very deep level of our consciousness. Now, if you take other things like chemtrails, metallic particulates in the atmosphere, they're doing several things. They control weather, our biology, and as a real nasty side effect, they deteriorate our nervous system. In my clinical career, I've seen a great escalation of neurological diseases like ALS, for instance, that were very rare, almost non-existent. Now they're becoming epidemic. There's a reason for that. The real agenda in the long run, though, is genetically modifying the human race. Everywhere you look, we're exposed to genetic modification in our foods, and vaccines are the same thing.
Fundamentally, the vaccine agenda is a war on the ability of cells to clean themselves out. Instead, they're literally injecting children and people with these toxins, preventing the child, the person, from mounting a defense to clean these toxins out of their cells, and you end up with chronically sick people. This has been shown over and over again. you end up with more cancer, more arthritis, more heart disease, more chronic illness. We see it, before 1986 when the vaccine agenda really started, 11% of the children had a chronic illness. 2017, it's 54%.
Well, with regard to the so-called COVID vaccines, I think there are really two things that we know for sure. One thing is that it's a brand new technology in the world of vaccines, and we simply don't know that much about it. And the second thing we know is that it's extremely dangerous.
Crisis in America. Deaths up 40% among those aged 18 to 64 based on life insurance claims for 2021 after COVID-19 vaccine rollouts.
There are many things that we don't know. We don't know exactly what is in it. We don't even know if the same thing is in every vial of the same brand. We don't know what the long-term effects are. We don't really know if there's any consequences for people being around others who are vaccinated. So there are many things we don't know, but we certainly know more than enough to make the decision to stay as far away from an injection as possible.
So this website called How Bad Is My Batch? You can click on, say, Pfizer and look up your lot number to see how many deaths and injuries are associated with that lot number.
Interestingly, as one scrolls down, there's a drastic drop-off in the number of deaths and disabilities.
What does this mean? Placebos?
So for there to be this much variation, this could not be simply negligence, because, companies like Pfizer have been doing this manufacturing process for a long time. They couldn't possibly screw it up that bad. This has to be a planned effort to test different things. And unfortunately, I've learned from some pharmaceutical and FDA regulatory insiders that under the EUA status, there is allowed to be variation in the ingredients because it's still experimental and in development. So I think they use this loophole to carry this out in a clandestine manner for ill intent. So that would indicate that they're trying to spread out the deaths so to make them less obvious.
Also, it probably should be noted that they're pulling that data from VAERS, which, as we know, is underreported.
Absolutely. So, it may be a representative sample, but it certainly doesn't represent anywhere near the total number. There was one study done by Harvard Pilgrim Health where they tried to approximate how many vaccine adverse events are actually reported to VAERS, which is a voluntary system, and it's actually quite difficult to make a VAERS report. And what they found is that less than 1% of the vaccine adverse events and injuries that they found in their population were what was reported in VAERS. So you could really make an approximation by taking the VAERS numbers and multiplying by 100, and that would be a way to approximate the real number.
And what about the claim being asserted that the new injection technology is not gene therapy?
I initially likened the vaccine technology to GMO technology because the whole purpose of GMO is to take the genetic information from one organism and put it into a different organism and have that organism make a foreign gene product. In other words, make something that they don't normally make, but that is coded for in the gene. And this is exactly how these vaccines are said to work, by giving the genetic material either in the form of messenger RNA or in the form of DNA, like in the Johnson & Johnson product. And those are the instructions to make the spike protein in the recipient.
So let's fact check the fact checkers.
So this is on Moderna's website. How does mRNA differ from gene therapy? They say they take fundamentally different approaches, but it describes gene therapy and gene editing as altering original genetic information that the cell carries to produce a permanent fix to the underlying genetic problem by changing the defective gene. So in other words, instead of repairing the defective gene, it's replacing it with another gene. So the International Immunology Journal, development of COVID-19 vaccines utilizing gene therapy technology. Anytime that we're altering or hacking the genetic machinery of a natural organism, that is genetic tomfoolery, whether we call it therapy or not.
So what do you think about all of this, Jason?
There's no going back now. You can't unknow what you know. From what I've been able to understand about the way things really work, it's all about frequency, and consciousness guides frequency.
You know what comes to mind when you say that? That famous tuning fork experiment.
Where they strike one tuning fork, say an F sharp, and another F sharp will vibrate because it's the same frequency?
Yeah, exactly.
Everything we are taught is this reductionist, materialist paradigm of everything's a particle, everything's physical in the material world. But here, we're talking about that that's not all there is, right? That there is this other unseen, non-material part, and it has a lot of influence, and perhaps it may really be guiding the material world. We just talk about it as being an emergent property, or when it's perhaps the most significant thing that there is for health.
With waveform physics, you're really acknowledging that thoughts are things. Every single thought that we have creates an event, an electrical event, and a polarization. And that polarization, in turn, creates a vibration, just like a static guitar string. Emotions give the velocity for those electrical forces to pop into manifestation in the first place.
So if every thought we have, every word we speak or write, every intent seeks resonance with the matching frequency, then we are responsible for everything we create.
Everything.
For me, water is a spiritual teacher. The glass of water that you drink, you can look at it and think, well, it's just a glass of water. Well, that glass of water has been through the clouds, it has been through the trees, it has been through your ancestors and everybody else's ancestors. When somebody passes on, what leaves? The human body is only left with bones and then eventually dust. The fluid, the water, it leaves, it evaporates. It's always reincarnating. It doesn't die. It can be polluted, but it's always in one of its phases. So if we are made up of so much water, then what happens to us? Even when you're cremated, the water leaves and ashes, the ashes of cremation are actually salts. We are an ocean. We are liquid crystal beings.